Sit.
Mr. Holmes, just before we broke, you were giving us the benefit of your view as to why these operations were being shut down, and in particular the one that you've just been telling us about into Rodham Twiss. And one of the things, of course, you said was it could have stopped the policeman's career for the reasons you gave. Looking at it the other way round, the arrest and successful prosecution of a big fish, might that not make somebody's career?
Yeah, depending on who the big fish was, yes.
Yeah. But did anybody perhaps not see things that way, or if ambition or the risk to career ambition was one of the reasons why these things didn't go any further, do you think that people at that time would have seen it the other way, that perhaps a successful prosecution could make a career rather than break it?
Undoubtedly so. The successful prosecution of senior targets can be a career maker, such as senior drugs villains, major gangsters in Soho, that kind of thing. Yeah. But the risk, well, I wouldn't know, I was a constable, but the risk from a senior officer's point of view of this type of case is that you're going up against extremely connected people. Yeah. And you're running very, very serious risks that what you achieve may not be seen by others as an achievement.
So do you think there was an element of undue deference towards people in that sort of position? Or tolerance of what they were doing for an easy life?
Yeah, but I wouldn't say necessarily an easy life, but to avoid the problems that we just discussed.
You were asked about whether Neil Diver might have been the officer that had shut this operation down, and having thought about it, do you still think it was more likely to be Brian Sparks?
I think it was Sparks. I thought, and I said in my original statement to the inquiry, that I thought Diver came after Brian Sparks. Having read Bob Glenn's statement, I'm not sure I'm correct. It may have been that Diver preceded him. Yeah. But my own recollection of the issue was that, and certainly in terms of the senior officer that I had the argument with, it was Chief Superintendent Sparks.
Which rather suggests it was more likely to be Sparks who was responsible for shutting it down, doesn't it, or not?
It's a possibility. So Mr. Glenn says in his statement that there were no chief inspectors or superintendents in that era. But that's not how I remembered it. There was certainly a club's superintendent and a club's chief superintendent.
So you remember the corporate structure differently?
Yeah.
Tell us this, do you remember what became of Neil Diver?
He was transferred off of C Division following an incident, and then after that, so I've no idea. I understand again from reading Mr. Glenn's statement and the Conifer report that Mr. Diver may be deceased.
Yeah. You say in your statement to paragraph 30 that it was allegedly as a result of inappropriate conduct within the Regent Palace Hotel in Piccadilly Circus. Is that something you heard at the time?
It was the incident itself, so it was general police gossip around the West End.
Right.
It wasn't until I read Bob Glenn's statement that I actually got slightly more detail.
Yeah. Now, at the end of your time in the club's office, did you go back to Vine Street?
Yes, sir, that was the normal thing.
And did you continue the sort of work you'd been doing before, patrolling Piccadilly Circus, that kind of thing?
Yes, sir.
And do you remember the year following the Twiss inquiry being ordered to stop arresting rent boys for the offence of importuning?
Yes, sir.
And were you provided with any explanation why?
No, so just ordered.
But looking back, rather than any sinister reason, can you see a little more clearly why that may have been at that time?
The order was given to me, sir, by the C Division commander, Mr. Edward Stowe. Mr. Stowe was a fairly legendary figure in the Metropolitan Police at that time as an old school copper, a leader of men that held a very dim view of the younger, higher flying officers at New Scotland Yard. So it would have been difficult to imagine him being if you will, intimidated or required to make decisions for those reasons that we've discussed. It may have been because I recall at that time that we were sort of caught somewhat between a rock and a hard place, because members of the public were frequently complaining about being solicited by male prostitutes in Piccadilly Circus, which is why there was usually fairly consistent action against those prostitutes. But at that time there was also emerging almost nascent signs of complaints from the homosexual community that in fact the Metropolitan Police were oppressing homosexuals and picking on them. So it may simply have been that politically and it would have been more sensitive to lower the pressure.
Yeah.
I don't know what the reason was, so I wasn't given. I asked for a reason, didn't get one.
You didn't go on. But did you stop that practice of arresting boys for those offences?
Not entirely.
So you carried on?
Yes, but not to the same level.
Now, I'd like us all, please, to consider a document. You've got it, Mr. Holmes, in your tab 2, but I'd like you put up on screen, please, as well. WTP 000012. And we can see at the top, it's an officer's report dated the 30th of November 2017,
Yes, sir.
under the authorship of Sarah Kearns, I think is perhaps how you pronounce her, and we can see at the bottom that this was an Operation Conifer inquiry, which was a telephone conversation with you on that date.
That's correct.
Now, before I go further into the note, how did it come about that you were talking to this officer of Operation Conifer?
The background to that, sir, was that I had a call at home, a cold call, if you will, from a journalist called Paul Cahalan.
Yeah.
And at the conclusion of our conversations, he asked me if I would give him permission to pass my details to Operation Conifer. Certainly he told me, and my impression was that he had very close links to Operation Conifer. And he asked me if I would have any objection to him giving my contact details to Conifer, and that then followed with the phone call from Cairns.
But did he tell you what his interest was, or
Yeah, in the conversation I had with Cahalan, it was clear that he was very, very knowledgeable in relation to all of this background and allegations, and that according to him, he'd been working on it for a considerable number of years. And that he was in close contact with Operation Conifer, and as such he wanted to pass my details to them so that I could disclose to them what I knew about Rodham Twiss.
So that was the focus of his inquiry, Rodham Twiss?
Yeah.
And so it was that you had this conversation with the detective constable.
That's correct.
I don't want to go through all of it, but there are a few things I'd like to pick up with you.
Yes.
First of all, towards the bottom half of that page, it's on screen if it helps as well, Mr. Holmes. Do you see Paul Holmes was not able to name any victim, nor was he able to identify any possible offender by name other than Twiss. And does that remain the case?
Yes, pretty much.
So if I ask you about well-known names such as Cyril Smith, Jeremy Thorpe, Leon Britton, Edward Heath, as far as you're concerned, did any of those names come up in the Twiss operation that you were involved with?
Not to my, well, beyond Cyril Smith, not to my knowledge, sir.
Why did you say beyond Cyril Smith?
Well, because Cyril Smith was mentioned, and it was anticipated, as I said before lunch, that his activities in the Piccadilly Circus area had been noted before, and he was expected to come into the operation. His name was mentioned, the other three, no.
Fine. Did you ever see, on any observations, Cyril Smith?
No.
And did you yourself ever see on any observations the other three men whose names I've mentioned to you?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever hear of their names?
There were discussions.
Yeah. There was a report which whichever chief superintendent it was, before the operation was shut down. Do you remember that? That's what Mr. Sinclair has told us, that there was what he called an initial report in writing that was submitted, he thought, to Chief Superintendent Diver, but it may not matter which it was for the moment. Do you remember anything about that?
I don't specifically remember any written reports, and normally it would be done verbally.
Yeah, well,
Certainly at this stage.
And-
It may have been different if he was seeking a warrant.
Well, he wasn't. That's what Bob Glenn was doing, and that was at another period, you told us. But what he wanted to do was to further the inquiry. And what he said was that an initial report in writing was prepared to go up to the chief superintendent, which he thought was co-authored by you. And in it would or should have included all of those four names as having been seen during the course of the operation so far. And what do you say about that?
All I can tell the inquiries is, to the best of my recollection, certainly Smith would have been involved in the report, if there was such a report. I don't specifically remember it. I have no recollection of references to the other three names you mentioned, and I have to say that if those names had been mentioned, I wouldn't have forgotten.
No, exactly. They're hardly forgettable, are they?
No, exactly. Well, I just also say for balance, as I mentioned earlier, Chair, we worked on different roles at different times. So I'm not saying that these people were never seen.
Yeah.
What I am saying is I didn't see them, and other than Cyril Smith, I have no recollection of the other names being mentioned during the preparation of any report, if there were such a document. And as Mr. Altman said, if names such as that had been mentioned, you wouldn't forget them.
If we go to the second page of this document, please. About halfway down, we see your surname, Holmes stated that he and Malcolm Sinclair. That passage, please.
Yes, sir.
Were called off their activities regarding Rodham Twist by a senior officer. He was not given any specific reason other than there needed to be a reallocation of resources. That doesn't appear in your inquiry statement, but was that your memory when you spoke to this detective constable in 2017, that was the excuse that was given?
Well, as far as I was concerned, it was an excuse that we were reallocated to another inquiry.
And at the foot of that page, you talk about Simon Danchuk.
That's correct.
Where does he come into the story?
Dan, in terms of my relationship or my conversations with the journalist Cahalan, that actually initiated from Danchuk, as far as I'm aware. I can't remember whether it was March 2016 or March 2017, but I remember I was in a shopping mall in Portsmouth with my wife when my phone went and I was cold called by Simon Danchuk. And he then started to discuss with me this affair and a wider context and asked me if I would be prepared to meet with him at Portcullis House, together with his parliamentary assistant, to discuss the matter further. So I agreed with him that when I was next in the United Kingdom, I would go to Portcullis House and discuss the matters with him. And that's what I actually did.
And you think this is 2016, 2017?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Certainly not before 2016, sir. On balance, probably 2017.
So you think that late? Was Simon Danchuk still an MP at that point?
Oh, definitely.
In 2017? All right.
But I needed some permit to get in to see him as a parliamentary official.
Did you actually go to see him?
Oh, yeah, I saw him at Portcullis House with his assistant.
Right. And what was it he wanted?
He wanted well, they already knew, or appeared to know, a great deal of detail. And they effectively just wanted me to confirm a number of things and discuss what I knew about Twist.
Yeah. And is that what you did? As for Paul Cahalan, did you ever talk to him beyond the contact that you already told us about?
Yeah, I discussed Twist with him.
With him as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, effectively, when he called me, he knew virtually everything about Twist anyway.
Right.
The thing with Dan, if I can just enlarge for 1 second, sir. The thing with Danchuk his position was, at that time, if that helps with nailing down the chronology, there was the issue going on in Parliament about whether there would or wouldn't be an inquiry. The Labour MP, Tom Watson, was leading it, and there was discussion about there should be some kind of official inquiry into it, some kind of network cover-up. And Danchuk wanted to talk to me about any input I would have into that. So that was the context of why he wanted to see me.
Thank you. Can I ask you then, finally, as far as this document is concerned, and direct your attention to the final page? That is the final page. The penultimate page, which reads, in conclusion. It's the passage which reads, in conclusion, at the top. Holmes stated that at the time, the late 1970s, and she quotes this, everything was going on in the West End. There were too many people saying the same thing. It was a cover-up of the boys being abused. There was information but no evidence. And you went on to say that not one of the VIPs involved in the abuse have any concern about closure for victims. You said that those who have been abused often become reliant on alcohol or drugs. They often develop mental health issues and are referred to as fantasists. And that you said that victims of abuse just want someone to believe them. And you pick up that theme. If we go back, please, to your inquiry witness statement.
Yes, sir.
Paragraph 36 on page 7.
Yes, sir.
Let's put it up on screen so we can follow this. It's INQ 003901. INQ 003901, page 7. Paragraph 36 to the bottom.
Yep.
You were asked to explain the comments which I've just read into the record, in which Detective Constable Cairns of Operation Conifer recorded. And what I really want to ask you is what you mentioned. You've already said something about this already, about the difficulty with the type of boys who would frequent places like the meat rack and their perceived credibility for the purposes of the criminal justice system. But can you expand a little, focusing on what you had to say to the inquiry in these paragraphs, please?
Yes, sir. Well, I've spent the best part of 40 years working mainly with victims in this type of context, Chair, and particularly those that have been exploited. And my experiences have taught me this, that in many of these cases, the issue for the victims of abuse, whether they were children or young adults, effectively the abuse itself and the abuser after time is not the issue. They become immune to it. The issue is that nobody believed them at that time. And the thing that concerned me about all of this issue was that whether or not individual cases simply were not established or not proved or were false, doesn't then follow that all the allegations are false and that none of this happened. And that was the way it was being portrayed.
Yeah.
And I was trying to establish the fact that from the police perspective, and I'll be perfectly frank here, any case involving male or female prostitutes was regarded by most officers as a nightmare, because in terms of managing them to get a statement and then through to a jury is extremely demanding, because they're very fragile, emotional, vulnerable people. Then, if you are able to achieve their presence in the witness box, their background, such as alcohol abuse, substance abuse, convictions, proven lies, serves to effectively destroy their credibility as witnesses of truth. So even if they get to court, without the corroboration, it's a loser. That was the point I was trying to expand on in the paragraphs following that.
Absolutely. But also then, thank you for that, but focusing also on everything was going on in the West End, too many people saying the same thing, cover-up of the boys being abused, no information, it was information but no evidence. Can we go to, which is the next page, page 8.
Yes.
So from 41 down to 46.
Yes.
You say, my comment that everything was going on in the West End was a summary of the fact that the West End was the magnet for all forms of vice and that heterosexual and homosexual sexual exploitation of adults and children was taking place alongside each other. And you've already made that point a few times before. And you say, notwithstanding deeply ingrained scepticism, I, together with many colleagues working in this field, came to hold the view that too many people were saying the same thing for there not to be at least some truth in the assertion that establishment figures were engaged in the sexual abuse of young males and that this activity was being covered up.
Yes.
And when you say too many people were saying the same thing, did you mean victims of this form of abuse?
A range of sources. So it was too many informants were alleging the same thing. Informants that themselves were active in the homosexual community but disagreed with any form of exploitation of underage boys in particular. We had it from the Johnny Go Home documentary, from the conviction in Playland 2. If my memory serves me correctly, in his closing remarks, the trial judge, Alan King Hamilton, made the point to Charlie Rowland that it was clear he wasn't the only one involved. So what I'm trying to point out there is that so many triangulated sources were saying it was happening, it was almost beyond logic that it couldn't have been. And the issue was to what extent.
Does that include not merely that establishment figures were involved, but that the activity was being covered up?
Well, as far as I was concerned, it was being covered up.
Who were the sources? Were there extraneous sources for that, or was that your own personal experience?
Well, there were other. I mean, I had extensive discussions with, as we talked before lunch, with Maurice Mayland, Dick Griffin, Pete Lamb, who'd all experienced the same thing. For example, I recall that after Playland 2, after there was a storm of media coverage over that case, and so the same with Johnny Go Home. There were alleged to be then there were going to be massive exposures of all of the others that were involved in it, and it all just got dropped. So what I'm trying to explain is that there were so many different examples from such a multiplicity and diversity of sources that it was defying logic to say it doesn't exist, it's a fantasy. I'm not saying individual cases weren't a fantasy or incapable of proof, but I'm saying if one case is a fantasy, it doesn't wipe out the rest.
No. So it's not one size fits all.
No.
And then you continue 45 and 46. As far as I can recall, the issue for colleagues working in the West End, as I did almost constantly from 1971 to 2002, the question was not whether it was occurring, but why it wasn't being exposed. And is that something that you were just saying to us, that it was going on, but it all came to nothing?
Yeah, and the events were repeated in the mid-80s with the Operation Circus case with Prochotsky and others. And again, there were intelligence in terms of the involvement of senior people, and nothing happens.
And you say the simplistic and convenient answer to that question was the fact that the allegations were rarely supported by tangible and probative evidence provided by credible victims, and you've made that point several times. And then finally, in 46, you say, in my view, there were two main reasons for this absence of probative evidence. The victims of the abuse were either too fearful and distrustful to make formal complaints concerning their abuse, and or the capacity of independent police operations to fully expose the criminality was thwarted by some senior police officers in order to cover it up.
Yes, sir.
For the several reasons or possible reasons that you've given.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Can I go back, please, in this statement to your paragraph 14 on page 3?
Yes, sir.
Do you remember when we started your evidence about the Rodham Twist case?
Yes.
And you said in the final lines of paragraph 14 that you were directed to investigate Twist based on an intelligence profile that had been developed by the intelligence unit of the club's office, and you explained earlier that it sounded far more fancy than it actually was at the time. But I'm asked to ask you the following questions. First of all, the intelligence which you set out in paragraph 15, based on the work of the intelligence unit, what was the source of the intelligence? Can you tell us?
No, I wouldn't have known the original source.
No.
I had suppositions, but I didn't know, and I wouldn't have asked.
And were you aware of any other ongoing covert investigations into this case, outside of what you and your colleagues were doing?
No, sir. And I have to say, as you mentioned before, Lance, Mr. Altman, it would have been a ludicrous situation if there were more than one operation running in tandem. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Holmes. Those are all the questions I think I need to ask you. I'll ask the chair and the panel if they have any.
There's a question from Mr. Frank.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please, just one matter. You were asked about the other names apart from Smith that was been suggested you'd heard, and you said you'd not yourself had any knowledge or sightings of any of those in your observations.
That's correct.
But what you did say was there were discussions. Can you help us? What discussions you were referring to?
Well, obviously, when we're working a case, the team working will discuss the day's evidence. I have no recall of mentions of the other three names, but certainly during the discussions, Smith was mentioned, although I myself never saw him.
But those discussions didn't involve those other three names.
Not that I recall, no.
Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Frank.
Just clear the